Wednesday is World Press Freedom Day, and journalists around the world are finding themselves increasingly under fire. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the freedom of the press. It's up there as one of the world's most dangerous jobs. Journalists risk their lives to tell the world about conflicts and crises. But the greatest danger we face is often from people in positions of authority. From Mexico to the Philippines and even the US, attacks on the media are becoming increasingly common. But today, we turn the spotlight on the situation here in Turkey, which has been criticized by international rights groups for its treatment of journalists. Most journalists have been detained on charges of undermining national security. The Turkish government says it faces a threat from a range of terror networks that have infiltrated certain professions, and that many of those arrested use media to spread violence, not news. But critics say legitimate media workers are being caught up in a crackdown. So, are anti-terror laws being abused? We begin with this report from Ali Mustafa.
They were just people doing their jobs, but who paid for it with their lives. More than 900 journalists killed in the past 25 years. Among them are journalists such as Sayyid Salim Shehzad. He was murdered in 2011 after reporting on how Al-Qaeda had infiltrated Pakistan's Navy. And freelance journalist James Foley, who in 2014 was captured by Daesh in Syria and was beheaded. And Iraqi Kurdish journalist Shifa Gardi, who was killed in an explosion while covering the battle for Mosul.
Journalists go to the most dangerous places to give voice to the voiceless. Media workers suffer character assassination, sexual assault, detention, injuries, and even death.
According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 81 members of the press were in prison globally in the year 2000. This number jumped to 259 by 2016. It includes 7 Palestinian journalists detained and arrested by Israel. Amnesty International calls the detention without charge of some Palestinian journalists unjust and cruel. According to the CPJ, Turkey has the highest number of jailed press members, with 81 journalists in prison. The CPJ says dozens of detained journalists haven't been formally charged, like the German-Turkish writer Deniz Yücel, who's accused of spying for the PKK terror group, but has been held without charge since February.
The issue of journalists in jail shouldn't be used as an anti-propaganda tool against Turkey. Some of those journalists are accused of committing serious crimes. This shouldn't be overlooked. And Turkey is going through a hard time since the July 15th coup attempt. We are fighting against terror groups on several fronts. Our priority is to protect the democratic institutions in Turkey.
The UN calls the detentions arbitrary.
Half of all the journalists that have been imprisoned seem to have been imprisoned in Turkey, and it's something that worries us. Journalism is not a crime in Turkey. It's an issue which we believe the government must pay deeper attention to.
But Turkey denies the charge. It says it's only arrested individuals with known connections to terrorist groups. Ali Mustafa, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by TRT World's editor-at-large, Ahmed Al-Burai, Hakkı Öcal, a columnist with the pro-government newspaper Daily Sabah, and from London, Milena Buyum. She's Amnesty International's campaigner for Free Turkey Media. Thanks, all of you, for joining us. It's a pleasure being able to facilitate this discussion. Milena, let's start with you. On this day, tell me why you're campaigning about Turkey.
Well, before I start explaining our campaign, I'd like to wish you a very happy World Press Freedom Day. You're all working there in the media, and it's important to mark this day. Amnesty International has been campaigning on freedom of expression in Turkey and press freedom for many years. But in the aftermath of the bloody coup attempt of last July, there has been a kind of obviously a huge sigh of relief that that coup attempt was not successful. What came soon after, however, was a massive crackdown on large numbers of people in all sectors of society. The public sector, as you know, it's over 100,000 people who have lost their posts, their jobs have been removed from public sector. 47,000 people have been remanded in prison pending their trial. And amongst those remanded in prison are journalists or other media workers that have been accused with very serious offences and have been in prison for many months now, some of them since right after the coup attempt. So Amnesty International is obviously concerned about human rights and in particular freedom of expression, and the large numbers of particularly media workers being amongst those imprisoned is of concern to us. So we began to look into what were the types of things that these individuals were accused of, for some of whom indictments have not yet been issued, but on others there have been only recently. For instance, in the case of the Cumhuriyet, journalists and executives, an indictment has been prepared, a 306-page indictment, which we have been through, and seen in there that the flagrant lack of evidence of any internationally recognizable criminal acts is quite astounding, actually, quite shocking. The individuals involved, journalists such as Ahmet Şık, a very well-renowned, respected investigative journalist, is contradictory even in its range. He's accused of basically aiding 3 different diametrically politically opposed armed groups just because he has interviewed individuals associated with them. We don't consider those evidence of internationally recognizable crimes.
Okay, so Milena set it out there, Ahmed and Haki. She set it out why Amnesty is campaigning on this day, particularly regarding Turkey. And she's, said about the context. She said, yes, Turkey had every right after the failed coup to try to sort this out, but she feels the Turkish government has gone too far. Haki, are those criticisms valid?
Oh, first of all, I appreciate what Amnesty International and Committee to Protect Journalists are doing. Having said that, I think what they are doing right now, as she did a second ago, is overgeneralization of the situation in Turkey. When you say hundreds of journalists are in jail, you think that there are policemen everywhere, every corner, and all the journalists working in a newspaper building or television building are scared to that they will raid in and they will be taken out. That's not the case. And in Cumhuriyet's case, yeah, we can discuss many, many things, but I think we need a better judgment from the public prosecutors. We need better prosecutorial discretion. I mean, these are journalists. These people are not running away next day. If you are going to indict them, and try them without arresting them. They could do it. They could be released on bail, on something, on their own self-recognition. So the public prosecutors or Turkish legal system shouldn't create this atmosphere, this scene. This is very detrimental to what is happening in Turkey. It is injustice, actually.
Okay, so Ahmed, so we have a situation where there might be some that have links to terror groups, there might be some that are hiding behind a veneer of journalism in order to promote propaganda for the PKK, you name it, right? But are others, as Haki maybe suggested, maybe because there isn't as good of prosecutorial judgment as he would like, are other innocent people maybe getting scooped up in this? Is that possible?
First of all, I have to admit that this is a very problematic issue that none of the journalists would be happy to speak about, other journalists who've been illegally prosecuted or in jail. Right. But to be honest, this is not This is completely not the case in Turkey. This is a kind of misleading assumption that is not true. If you just put the things out of context, you will see that you will come out with wrong conclusions.
Tell me what the context is.
Now, the context is we all have to admit that there was a brutal coup in Turkey, and there were people involved in this. These people were among the civil servants, they're among the journalists, they're in the media outlet working there, and we have to acknowledge that what happened in Turkey on the 15th of July was a brutal attack against democracy. The whole country was hijacked. 400, at least 300 people were killed in the coup attempt, and other things happened on the ground that if this happens in other countries, they would have greater and grave measures on the ground. Now, having said that, some of the journalists, some of innocent people have been taken into the prison. We can discuss about this. But if you just consider the media claimer and the media fuzz, international media, I mean, and the way they're trying to portray the issue, what's happening in Turkey, you would feel that there is a kind of gloomy medieval period that is happening to the media workers. But this is completely untrue again.
Milena, a lot of Turkish people I speak to here say, but you know, if you go through the newspapers, you see all sorts of criticism of the president, of the ruling party, and so on. How does that square with this idea that anybody who criticizes the government will be thrown in prison? To the point made by the other gentleman, and let me take that and throw it at you. Is there a lack of sympathy for the context within which Turkey is operating right now?
I can speak for the organization that I work for, Amnesty International. We've been very clear from day one that it was entirely legitimate to investigate how the coup attempt came about, and those responsible to be brought to justice in fair trials through investigations that unearth the actual evidence of their criminality. There is no argument on that point at all. The question is whether the individuals and figures vary. I mean, we estimate that there is over 120 journalists who have been remanded, who are currently in prison, who have been remanded since 15th of July of last year. That's a huge number of journalists, and they worked in practically all areas of dissenting media. So, we're talking about people who worked in the Kurdish media, people who worked in the mainstream but critical media, people who worked in digital media, etc. And the accusations against them vary. What we need to have, and obviously criminal prosecutions can apply to anyone. If somebody has committed a crime that's recognizable, then they face the consequences of that. However, what we have here in the indictments that have been issued, whether it be the Cumhuriyet indictment, which I went through, whether it be the Zaman indictment, which I also read, the evidence of actual criminal acts that are recognized under international law is not there. For Şahin Alpay, who used to write for Zaman, who is 73 and in ill health, the evidence cited are his articles, his columns from 2013 and 14, in which, yes, he was critical of the government. He did make references to, investigations into the corruption allegations and so on. These are not evidence of criminal activity. This is what you have in a society where freedom of expression is respected. Media can and has actually a duty of scrutinizing those in power. And when there is no incitement to violence or evidence of actual criminal activity, then the person does not get prosecuted and kept in prison pending trial for months on end.
Sure.
By the time that hearing, the first hearing is going to come around in September, Şahin Alpay would have been in prison for 13 months.
Okay,
You know,
and good point.
That's the situation in Turkey
good point.
for many
Ahmed, I
of
just want to
those
ask you. I want to ask you, as I bridge this to you, should an organization like Zaman be treated as every other organization?
You know, the point is you cannot be picky. I do respect what Amnesty International and other organizations are working and highlighting and shedding the light on the suffering of anybody. But the point is you cannot be picky whenever it comes to objective assessment of the situation here in Turkey. I'll give you some concrete, solid, direct examples of the people that have been tackled as victims in the international media, in the human rights organization and stuff. Just take the tweets of these guys. Like, for example, the renowned Can Dündar. And he tweeted one day, "You should not have exploded that last bomb." He's referring to the twin bombing that happened in Ankara, and he directly accuses President Erdogan of committing that.
Okay, but let me ask you that before you go on, right? So some people watching this would say there are people in America who believe 9/11 conspiracy theories, and they believe George Bush orchestrated 9/11. They can tweet that out, and they don't have to worry about criminal liability. Is that situation different legally in Turkey? That sort of accusation of a president, accusing a president of being involved in terrorism, is that different? And does that mean, according to the laws of Turkey, you no longer have the rights of a journalist?
The first important thing, that's good. I'll come back to this one. But again, take the academic. He's very famous, Koray Çalışkan. He says, a man dragging his country into war to save himself, calling him an animal is a shame. Calling him a demon is a sin. But calling him a murderer is deserving. Now, we'll come to the United States. In the United States, threatening the president of the United States is a specific crime, carrying a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison and 250,000 in fines, which means just insulting the president here, according to the Turkish Republic, it was issued years ago in 1926. It wasn't when Erdogan came to power. So it's not Erdogan who is enforcing these kind of laws. Insulting the president is something, but accusing him of committing a crime, of killing his own people. If you look at one magazine, Nokta magazine, when he's taking, the president taking selfie behind him, the coffins of the Turkish soldiers. Just imagine that this happens in the United States at the time of this. George W. Bush is taking selfie while behind him the Twin Towers.
But there's a question of meaning and values.
Accept that?
Again, okay, so a question of meaning and values, and let me then pose that to Hakke. Is that different here in Turkey, where if you do that sort of stuff on Twitter, you know you're likely to be thrown in jail, whether you're a journalist or not?
No, you are not going to be thrown in jail if you simply insert your opinion into a discussion without, of course, violating the laws, very old laws. Even Erdogan was not born by then. Imran, we have to bring the attention of everyone to this fact that the perpetrator of the coup was not the Turkish army per se. It was a cult, religious cult, or beginnings were religious, but later it got its own aims and targets and everything. And they used every possible means for getting organized, propagate their ideas and everything. Zaman, you mentioned, is a publication house with televisions and everything in it. It was part of this cult.
But isn't it plausible that there are many people who just had a job as journalists, even though it might have been owned by people who eventually it would culminate, their relationship with the government will culminate in them trying to embark on a coup d'etat, right, as diabolical as that was. Is it plausible that some people were just journalists working for Zaman, doing their thing, and they got caught up in this? They had no involvement in the FETÖ movement?
According to some authors who really investigated the inner workings of this cult, came to this conclusion. It is one very hierarchical organization. It is very centric, and it is controlled centrally, and not one single person who is writing for this newspaper would utter one word on television or one word on press without the permission of certain authorities. Certain authority is this guy living in the United States in exile, this person, this religious so-called scholar. So we can safely assume that whatever you are writing for their newspapers is authorized by them.
But isn't it slightly, if I can just jump in here for a second, isn't it a good point from Milena that some people are being accused of being FETÖ and PKK and Daesh all at once sometimes?
And rightly so, because this dialogical organization, FETÖ, as we call in Turkey, is so organized that they are supporting the organizations who openly oppose them. I mean, look at Daesh. Daesh has nothing to do with Fethullah Gülen or anything, but we now know, according to, again, to some indictments, papers attached to the indictments, that they've been supporting Daesh indirectly. They are supporting PKK indirectly.
Is it legally possible, though, for one journalist to be a member of all these organizations?
Of course it is possible. Of course. Okay. That is why I mentioned that we need better prosecutors.
Okay, fair enough. Now, we are running out of time. So, Milena, let me ask you, if you had an audience here with the people in power, and they asked you, how can we make things better in terms of freedom of the press and freedom of media, what would you say in a sentence or two?
Well, I'd say release the journalists who are currently in prison for months on end from pre-trial detention. Ensure that they are subjected to fair trials without political interference. Ensure that if there is no actual concrete evidence of criminal acts, that they are not prosecuted. And, allow those over 156 media outlets closed by executive decree without a possibility of appealing it to reopen. Have a diverse, controversial and dissenting media that is lively, and this is what we need. People have to have different sources of information.
Would you understand if the United States considered, for example, ISIS a terror organization, which it does, and it saw a media organization within the United States as an arm of ISIS and it shut it down? Would you accept that within that context the United States had a right to shut it down? So similarly, the Turkish government, in considering Gulen affiliated organizations as terror organizations, it has a right to shut them down?
Where there is evidence of criminal activity, then yes, of course. I mean, this is the whole basis on which you would go forward in a state of rule of law. That's what you would base your prosecution, your investigations on, the evidence of criminal activity. Earlier one of your guests took the example of the selfie of the president. I mean, in 2003, there was a very famous photo of Tony Blair with explosions behind him in the context of the Gulf War. I don't recall anyone being prosecuted for creating that image or sharing it.
I wish that selfie
it's possible.
Was, at the time, the double-decker bus in London was behind, in 2007, was behind Tony Blair. The photo should be there, not the war in Iraq. The president of Turkey has a selfie while the coffins of his own soldiers behind him. But Tony Blair, as a war criminal, as the people of Iraq call him, he has a selfie while behind him the crime he perpetrated with the cooperation of
Milena's
Bush.
saying that still wouldn't have him prosecuted, no matter what, because it's just a picture and it's art and it's criticism. That's what she's saying.
The point is that the comparison is not objective. The media outlet was completely biased when portraying the president in this way. That's not the way it should be. The comparison should be the president of any modern country with a democratic, real jurisdiction system would accept that or not. Would the media do that or not? Is this professionalism or not?
Okay, but it's a hypothetical, though. So we wouldn't know for sure. But
the professional, can I just interject? I mean, the question of professionalism is a good one. I think, media that's good, news that's good, information that's accurate is to be judged by the readers and by those who are receiving that information. No one, including the president of any country, should be above criticism or satire or ridicule if any such thing is not involving, you know, appeals to violence or, you know, inciting violence and so on.
Okay.
So,
and
so
I think
there are,
Milena, that's where people
clear
do the
rules
I'm sorry,
in
guys.
international law.
I'm sorry, guys. I got to jump in here because I have other segments to move on to. I would love to continue this conversation, and I think it's important that we had this conversation. Milena Buyum, Ahmed Al-Burai, and Hakka Ojal, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Still to come on the Newsmakers, they're not exactly a beacon of gender equality, but Saudi Arabia has been picked by the UN to champion women's rights. So why'd they do it? And evidence of famine from Africa's hermit kingdom. Nurses in Eritrea smuggle out pictures of starving babies while the government refuses outside help. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Human rights groups are calling it an outrageous decision. Saudi Arabia has been elected to the UN Women's Rights Commission. That's despite being ranked one of the worst countries for gender equality in the world. Women there can't drive, can't get a license, can't travel without a male guardian. And they need permission from a man to get passports and medical care. So many people are wondering how on earth Saudi Arabia got voted in. Shoaib Hassan reports.
It was an unexpected decision, and a controversial one at that. The election of Saudi Arabia to the UN's Commission on the Status of Women angered many rights activists, and they only echoed what a senior UN representative had said earlier this year.
So my concern is that the government is in fact deferring to a relatively small portion of conservative voices within the kingdom, and that in doing so, it is not only seriously restricting the rights of women, but it is obstructing the economic progress and social progress which is aimed to be achieved through the Vision 2030 process.
Vision 2030 is the brainchild of Mohammed bin Salman, Deputy Crown Prince and heir apparent to the Saudi throne. It's part of an effort to open up the conservative kingdom, principally to economic investment and the development of infrastructural projects. That's led leaders like German Chancellor Angela Merkel to support the decision. She said it would encourage Saudi leaders to move faster on reform. The kingdom ranks 141 out of 144 countries on the World Economic Forum's gender gap rating. Women cannot drive there and are dependent on their male guardians for the most trivial of things. And the few who protest face jail time, like Summer Badawi. She was locked up for 7 months for advocating for women's right to drive. Badawi says things are changing, but only because of public pressure.
Social media sites are one of the few places where Saudis can vent their anger to say we have rights to exercise their freedoms that they think is legal.
Other human rights activists agree.
There's a human rights culture growing in Saudi society. People are waking up from the extremist-induced slumber of the past 40 years. And the greatest contribution has come from social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
A slow awakening may indeed be taking place in Saudi society. But is the kingdom really ready to take a leading role in assuring women's rights in the rest of the world? Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Riyadh by Saudi Affairs Specialist Ahmed Al-Ibrahim, and in Washington, D.C., Hala Dosari. She's a Saudi women's rights activist and writer. And in Tel Aviv, human rights activist Hilal Noya. He's the executive director of United Nations Watch, UN Watch. Thanks all of you for joining us. Ahmed Al-Ibrahim, let me begin with you. Does Saudi Arabia deserve to be on the UN Women's Rights Commission?
I think Saudi Arabia has progressed in the past 10 years so much. It came from nowhere to everything right now is about women. I mean, listen, the Saudi women is the solution for this country to advance so fast, Today, if you see the Saudi women, they are more progressed than the men. They are more educated, more committed, more giving, more contributing to the economy. The numbers have shown a spike in how much the Saudi women has entered the labor force, how many women own a commercial registration. The amount of the dollar wealth that the Saudi woman is managing is unprecedented. The contribution in the economy, especially in the past 5 years, you can sense. The minute the women are in these kind of fields that they are being positioned by the government right now, it's making the economy, it's making the government, it's making the private sector moves much faster. So yes, indeed, Saudi Arabia is on the right track. Saudi Arabia has a lot of ways to come into completing the whole resolution for women's rights in the kingdom. I know we have issues that contribute from the culture, and that in the progress of the government is trying to elevate the knowledge of the culture to accommodate, you know, these kind of opening for the women.
Okay.
You know, we are a country of 85 years.
Okay.
We're still young.
You made
America
your point.
took
Sure,
almost
Ahmed.
100 years in order to,
Okay, we've got a couple other guests as well. So you set out your thesis. Hala, according to Ahmed, Saudi is moving in the right direction in terms of women. So why not? As he said, we've come from nowhere to everywhere, as he put it. Does that ring true for you, Hala?
Of course not. So if he's referring to the Vision 2030 and the economic participation of women, it sits now at 18%, one of the lowest in the world. The Saudi government is putting forward participation in international government or in intergovernmental organizations only as a part of the PR and improving the public perception of Saudi Arabia as set forth and as an objective in the Vision 2030 by the Ministry of Culture and Information, but not necessarily reflected in how Saudi Arabia adhere and respect the human rights in general and the women's rights in particular. So women's, as you've mentioned, have been lobbying for more than a year, and for years actually, on simple basic rights like the right to commute, the right to travel, all of these issues which restrict their full realization of potential, their full engagement in the workforce. The highest number of women in the workforce only happened because women were allowed to work as cashiers and in the retail sector. It's not because women now are part of the decision making. There is only less than 5% projection of women participation in decision making. And this is really very small compared to any country, let alone to a country as Saudi Arabia, with its huge number of women who graduated, outnumber men in graduation from universities.
Yeah, those are
so
some
this
strong
is very
points.
much basically
some
contradicting to what the vision is promising.
Yeah. Okay. So Hilal, those who voted for Saudi Arabia to be on the commission, they basically wanted to encourage Saudi Arabia to put them on the right track. Do you buy that?
No, absolutely not. The fact is that electing Saudi Arabia to be on the United Nations Women's Rights Commission is like picking the fox to guard the chickens as he still wipes the feathers from his mouth from his last meal. I want your audience to understand how absurd it is when Belgium just admitted now that they elected Saudi Arabia. They effectively disclosed to the world that they sold out their principles of human rights for political gain. We know that the Belgians were forced to admit that not only did they vote for Saudi Arabia, but they gave instructions to inform the Saudis that they voted for them. That means it's a political deal was made, trading votes.
Yeah, we've been looking at your tweets and of course, the Twitter storm after this. And you tweeted, Hillel, that the Belgian Foreign Minister, Didier Reynders, said they voted the Saudis onto the UN Women's Rights Commission to try and make them into better feminists. You got some interesting replies. Let's go through some of them. One said, ridiculous, what's next? Electing Syria's Assad as High Commissioner of the UN Refugee Agency? Does he understand that just being a feminist, this is another one, is a criminal offense over there? And then this one's really interesting. The anti-logic statement of the century. Feminists are blind to all forms of misogyny in every country outside the Western world. Let's pose that to Hala. Hala, is there a racism of low expectations here where some Western feminists maybe go hard at misogyny in their countries, but maybe give countries like Saudi Arabia a free pass?
Of course, I do understand the intergovernmental organization and the UN in particular is now representing an icon of political relations more than real promoters of human rights and the values that they enshrine or that they promote, presumably promote. For activists, for feminists, so for people who are trying to advance women's rights, this is such a disappointing fact, basically. A lot of effort has been done in promoting our causes through the official channels, through intergovernmental organizations, the Human Rights Council and the CEDAW committees, and we have seen now that this is not something that is respected, and it only points to how much the process of the UN is really contradicting the mere values that they should promote.
Yeah, Ahmed, what the other two guests seem to suggest is that because Saudi Arabia is powerful and rich, other nations are placating it. It's not because of any sort of organic evolution within the kingdom. What do you think?
I think totally wrong. Saudi Arabia won the United Nations Security Council seat, and on the day of winning it, Saudi Arabia rejected the seat. So it's not a matter of Saudi Arabia, it's really playing this game and everybody's putting this scenario, oh, and Saudi Arabia is going to do this and going to do movement. You guys are making it bigger than its appeal. The United Nations, if we won the seat, we won it.
We're not making it
if
bigger.
we don't want it, it's irrelevant.
No, that's not true.
No, but let me tell you one thing. Let me tell you one thing.
No, that's
if Saudi
not true.
Arabia,
we
for example, on the driving of issue,
there are WikiLeaks documents of Saudi trades. The WikiLeaks produced documents of the Saudi ambassador
This is
making
irrelevant.
deals with
We
Russia
rejected
and
the
France
United. We rejected the United Nations Security Council. It doesn't matter to us. You can pull the seat and take it and give it to any country. What we're going to do for our country, it's what we're going to do for our people, or what the government is doing for the people. If, for example, for driving and guardianship, if the Saudi wants to close this subject, they would have brought Gallup polls from the United States, and they start launching them in each and every corner in the kingdom. You're gonna fight the ratio. You're gonna find the ratio of women or people accepting women to drive is 1 to 1,000. This society is conservative. The people still are not ready to do that. What the government is trying to do is to speed up all this by controlling the society.
Okay, so
I cannot yank things. I cannot change the wheel of a car while it's speeding.
Okay.
You know, and one more thing. For Hala, please, the fact that you just said is wrong. We have a lot of women in the engineering, we have in filming, we have doctors, we have philosophers, we have Lubna Liyan, we have Rima Benza, we have
Hala addressed this as well.
There are a lot of educated people. How come we're a very conservative society? So that's exactly, actually, he himself has actually contradicted his own thesis, because if there are all those kinds of women who are enrolled in education and higher education and unconventional, basically, professions, how come we're conservative societies? Yeah. And how come women in rural areas are driving
let me ask you a question. How many of those educated women that you're talking about, they represent the Saudi society? What, they are 7%? They are 17%? The government, there's a majority.
It doesn't matter. The government has a commitment to promote gender equality. It doesn't matter.
So what the government is trying to do is trying to do it by ease.
You're granting
look
rights.
At the facts. Look at the history of the United States. How long it took women to get their rights.
You can't keep on looking at the history. You can't look at this. Once the government decided to stop the religious police from patrolling the streets, once the government decided to put forward, I can't really speak like that.
It doesn't matter. Listen, if I were you, I would look at the cup half full.
Please give it a chance.
But let me say one thing, Ramon. By Saudi Arabia,
please give it a chance. Hala.
I can't really hear him, because if you go, yeah, please, just give me a time and then we can respond to each other. The idea that the government is trying to, is a very progressive government, and the only hindrance for the government to stop enacting and promoting rights is how conservative and retarded the people are. There are a number of activists from very conservative background who have supported women's rights and are now in prison. And the other thing is that the government role is not to follow whatever the society is being doing. The government role is to promote rights, is to protect and foster rights. Those who are not accepting to drive, they're not forced to. But the government is supposed to create the enabling environment for the people. And if the government is trying to do that outside but not in home, this is hypocrisy. This is just hypocrisy.
Okay.
So I can't really say that this is a good argument.
Okay, Ahmed, I want to bring in Hilal.
It's the role of the government to uphold and respect those values. Otherwise, they shouldn't be engaged in that.
Hilal, going back to the vote, the Belgian Prime Minister, Charles Michel,
Yes.
said, "I regret the vote," because there was a lot of pushback. Do you accept his apology? And do you think that they won't do this sort of thing again?
Well, what we're asking is we accept the apology. It's always good when a country recognizes they did something terrible, provided that they show evidence that they truly are remorseful. And the best thing that they could do to compensate for the terrible action that they and 46 other countries took, possibly Sweden, possibly Norway, possibly Ireland, is to introduce a resolution in June, next month, at the Human Rights Council, where Belgium is a member, to spotlight the gross and systematic abuses of Saudi Arabia against women, against people like Raif Badawi, innocent blogger who called for a free society, was thrown in prison, 10 years jail sentence, 1,000 lashes, 50 of which he received, the rest not yet. He should be released immediately. So we want to see Belgium and the other countries who may have voted for this to introduce a resolution and to consider removing Saudi Arabia from the Human Rights Council. Contrary to what the gentleman just said from Saudi Arabia cares very much to be elected. WikiLeaks documents, which we published, show that the Saudi ambassador in New York was doing trade deals, a letter with Russia, where the Saudi ambassador said, "Dear Russia, we hereby trade votes. We will vote for you, Vladimir Putin, and you will vote for us." We saw these deals made with numerous countries, including perhaps France and England, where we saw evidence of negotiations, and they haven't been. They haven't been denied. So the fact that Saudi Arabia is trading these things means they want this false badge of international legitimacy to hide the terrible crimes that they're doing against women and their own people. These crimes are not conservative crimes. You know, Ambassador Nikki Haley of the United States, she's a conservative. Those who support beheading and forcing women to live under gender apartheid, that's not conservative. That's fundamentalist, Wahhabist, radical, in violation of every single universal human right guaranteed by the United Nations and international conventions, which Saudi Arabia claims to belong to. So either, sir, you belong and commit to those human rights obligations, or you don't. And if, as you say, you don't respect those human rights obligations, you have no business being on the world's Women's Rights Commission telling women around the world how they can get empowered or gender equality. It's absolutely a disgrace. And that's what Belgium recognized, and that's why they have to apologize. And we want to see a resolution in June to remove Saudi Arabia from the Human Rights Council.
Ahmed, at the heart of this, there's a fundamental paradox, isn't it? And Hala has called it out as well, where you have women who can maybe even have PhDs in economics or engineering or whatever you want to name it. But they are exactly the same as every other woman in Saudi Arabia, where they can't drive, they can't travel without a mahram, they can't do certain jobs. They still don't have the rights they need, no matter how well educated they are. And you point that out, and that's a great thing that they're very well educated. But what does it mean when they don't have fundamental rights? The other two guests are right, aren't they, Ahmed?
I don't think, listen, we are not the perfect nation when it comes to women's rights and everything. We have only two issues, and two issues only, is women driving, which has been over-exercised, and the guardianship. And I agree with you. Women need to commute to their offices.
No, there's gender apartheid. Women in restaurants can't sit in the same places. There's complete gender apartheid in South Africa. There's many more issues. Women in restaurants cannot sit in the same places as men.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ahmed?
Imran, this is the
women
problem.
Women are not equal under law. Women are excluded. There's complete gender apartheid.
Can I finish? I did not interrupt you. Can I finish? Can I finish? Can I finish? I did not interrupt you, so hold on to your horses. So what I'm saying is, both of you gentlemen, probably they're doing their search on Google. If today, Imran, and I invite you to come to Saudi Arabia and sit in the restaurant and look, if the men are sitting in a separate gender, go to the entertainments that is happening in Saudi Arabia and look at that and look how people are mixing and mingling with respect. We are not going to have people blowing up DJs or trying to do whatever they're trying to do. We are going to progress within the Saudi people likeness and what our culture accepts. We are not going to follow any Western country.
And that sort of emphatically put your point in a nutshell.
So let me tell you one thing.
Hold on.
Let me tell you one thing.
I want to give Hala the final word.
And the educated
we have one Saudi woman on this panel, so I want to give her the final word, if you don't mind, Ahmed. Hala, you're the only Saudi woman on this panel.
The
final
thing
word.
is, what is he saying about the progress? The progress is not from the government. The progress is from the people. And what happens when one of the women is challenging the status quo and trying to earn the money and join the workforce?
The Commission of Entertainment belongs to the government, which belongs to MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. No, it does.
No,
please say your facts right. I accept criticism, but put facts to your words. All the facts you said, all the numbers you said are
who are the conservative
wrong.
people who
Probably
are
you did not visit the kingdom for the past 20 years.
And be on the Women's Rights Commission. That's crazy.
Okay, let's give Hala 20 seconds to wrap us up. Hala, go ahead. I won't let the other guys interrupt.
Well, basically what I'm saying is that the argument that people are not ready for women's rights or for human rights is a false argument. People have been aspiring for that, lobbying for that, advocating for that, and it's the responsibility of the government to respect the rights. The government is the authority that arrests women who are trying to join the workforce, who are trying to challenge the status quo, and the government is the one arresting women who drive. It's not the society. And I think...
Not true.
So the government is not arresting women who are driving.
It's been good to have all of you on. I hope we can do it again. Thanks so much for joining us.
When I get out of here, I'm going to change my life. I hope that my new life will be good. When I was first freed from Daesh, I was so happy, thank God. And then we arrived in Misrata safely. Now I'm going somewhere new, and I'm very happy.
They're the words of an Eritrean refugee who escaped from her country and, after being held by Daesh, was eventually freed in Libya. Remarkably, you could say she was one of the lucky ones. More than 5,000 people flee Eritrea every month, with reports that the region's crippling famine is having a devastating impact there. But little is known about the extent of the crisis because very little information makes it out. The African nation competes with North Korea for the world's most secretive state. But a group of activists are fighting back. They've helped nurses smuggle out photos of malnourished babies, despite the dangers. They say it's evidence that people are starving, and yet the Eritrean government is accused of refusing all outside help because they don't want to become dependent on foreign aid. I'm joined now by human rights lawyer Daniel McConnell. He was a judge in Eritrea. He's now the head of the Eritrean Law Society in Geneva, and he co-authored The African Garrison State about Eritrea's descent into repression. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. McConnell. So we know the famine is terrible. There's starvation, cholera outbreaks. Is it absolutely clear that the government is actually rejecting help?
Yes, definitely. The government has never acknowledged the looming situation, the humanitarian crisis, which is now up for happening in the form of famine, of course, partly which is part of drought, a natural phenomenon, and partly exacerbated by flawed government policies, economic and agricultural policies, and there has never been official acknowledgement on the part of the Eritrean government, which is very sad, but we have been receiving this information since end of 2015. By December 2015, we were already receiving information, credible information, coming out from within Eritrea, and this is very difficult situation.
How much of a risk is it for those nurses who smuggled out those images that we've seen of those kids in a dire situation? How much is it a risk, of a risk is it for them and their safety?
Well, they do it in extremely difficult circumstances. You know, this kind of information may be treated with the most the most severe punishment that comes from the Eritrean government. They have to do it under extremely difficult, extremely dangerous circumstances, and which is very much appreciated from our side. And these are some of the very few sources of our information on what's happening in Eritrea. Perhaps another additional very important element I would like to add, something I should have mentioned at the very beginning, is that although we are now talking about famine, about drought, about some sort of natural disaster, we should also remember that this is a country whose government is now officially accused by the United Nations, or a commission of inquiry mandated by the United Nations, which is now accusing the government of Eritrea of committing crimes against humanity. And we should remember crimes against humanity are one of the most serious crimes of international law, which are punishable by the International Criminal Court. If we add up the latest issue of drought and famine to this factor, it really gets a very sad situation. And that's why we are now calling on the international community to take up its responsibility in trying to alleviate the suffering of the Eritrean people.
Yeah, but what about those who would say, if there's suffering and there's starvation and a humanitarian crisis, usually when countries are in trouble, no matter how egregious the regime is, they sometimes let in help, right? But now you have these countries like Eritrea saying, there's no problem here, nothing to see here, don't even give us any help. What about the argument that then that would require some sort of humanitarian intervention, which to Eritrea would mean a military sort of intervention from the outside? That can't go down well, can it? Who's going to be prepared to sort of invade the country to feed starving people?
Well, first of all, I think there are other steps that need to be taken before that. And we have been saying this now for a very long period of time. Before we go to some sort of military intervention in the name of humanitarianism or other accepted or not well accepted reasons, there are other steps that need to be taken. First and foremost, we need to recognize that the most responsible individuals for what's happening in Eritrea are a few, I would say, high-ranking government officials, which can be taken as the most responsible, and we should really first focus on them. Other important steps, I said, when I say this, I mean, for example, I can give you examples in the form of targeted sanctions that can be imposed. It could be by the United Nations, it could be by the African Union. I'm not saying here generalized economic sanctions. There is a big difference between these and between what I'm saying. But we can, the international community can speak in terms of targeted.
Yeah, but you know, they'll turn to the people and they'll say, you see, it's because
travel bans.
Sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, but they'll turn to the people and say, because of Western sanctions, even if it's AU, they'll say it's Western sanctions that are the reason for you starving. We've seen it happen with dictator after dictator all over the world. So it's lose-lose, right? They'll say you're starving because of the West, not because of us. We're your saviors.
Yeah. And that's why I'm saying I really want to differentiate between generalized economic sanctions. I don't support them. I'm talking about targeted sanctions, which are focused only on specific individuals, high-ranking government individuals.
Daniel McConnell, it's been good to talk to you. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. In the next installment in our special series that we've been doing all week, we'll ask the Hungarian government if they're committing human rights abuses against refugees. But that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.